and welcome to PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale history, where today we'll be talking about our final DLC character and our final third-party character as well. Today we're looking at Isaac Clarke from sci-fi survival horror series Dead Space. Released in 2008, Dead Space put you aboard the USG Ishimura, a mining ship that lost contact with the company, and a ragtag band of specialists headed out to investigate. Isaac, named for influential sci-fi authors Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, was one of this team. He volunteered to join the team due to the presence of his girlfriend on the lost ship, and because his knowledge as an engineer could prove useful to the investigation. Upon exploring the ship, it became obvious something was wrong when nobody was around. Oh, and then terrifying deformed monsters started bursting out of the vents and tried to murder everyone. The group got separated, leaving Isaac to fight his way through to find the truth about what happened. The game was a hit, praised by survival horror fans for its atmosphere, action and design, shamelessly taking inspiration from movies like Alien and Event Horizon. Gameplay involved a mixture of fending off attacks from the creatures and puzzles revolving around engineering and spaceship repair. Isaac himself was originally a mysterious silent protagonist whose face we never saw due to it being permanently concealed behind a space helmet, but the second and third games gave him a voice and a personality, and we tended to see his face a little more in an attempt to humanize him and make him more relatable as a character. Two sequels to the first game were released off the back of its success, with Dead Space 2 being widely praised, although Dead Space 3 was slightly controversial due to the inclusion of cover shooting and microtransactions in a full-price survival horror title. Speaking of controversies, Isaac's inclusion as a DLC character for PlayStation All-Stars was not exactly met with open arms. As a multi-platform title, Dead Space wasn't high on people's list for representation, and many viewed it as a cynical way of advertising Dead Space 3. I'm not going to try and justify his inclusion either, since I found it an odd choice too, but hey, I like Dead Space, so I was cool with him being included. So let's take a look at where all his moves came from. Firstly, one of the more iconic things about Isaac was the fact that he spent much of his time in a spacesuit, with his face almost always concealed with a visor covered in thin lights. This visor became such a well-known signifier for Isaac as a character that the second game's cover was nothing more than this face. This cover is potentially where one of Isaac's intros comes from, where he walks up to the camera giving an extreme close-up of his face. But that's not all. In the second game, there is a section where Isaac jetted through space at high speed before crashing into a building. As he fell through the building, he began to steady himself using his suit's jet boots before eventually hitting the ground with a thud. He then pulled himself to his feet and stretched out a little. This seems to be the origin of two more of Isaac's intros, one where he lowers in using jet boots, and the other where he hits the ground and stretches in a similar manner to the original game. The enemies of Dead Space were necromorphs. Born from hideously mutated corpses infected with an alien virus, these creatures came in various shapes and sizes, and were capable of inflicting gruesome deaths on Isaac throughout the games. The only way to stop them was to remove their limbs, and Isaac decided that the best way to do this was to use modified engineering tools. Isaac's staple weapon was the plasma cutter. Originally designed as a tool for cutting clean and precise lines in metal and other materials, Isaac modified one that he found on the Ishimura into a small handgun. This was his basic weapon in all three games, and was the first weapon that you found. In the first game, Isaac found one on the Ishimura, in the second one he found one being used for medical purposes and altered that, and in the third he just kind of had one lying around the house. Being Isaac's basic weapon, it wasn't the most powerful, but it was a general all-rounder. Good at precise shots, a decent shooting and reloading speed, and ammo was relatively easy to obtain. So naturally this is also in PlayStation All-Stars. Isaac can fire off a few shots of his plasma cutter before he needs to reload. It's a slow move, but its rate of fire is similar to the original games, and it has a decent range, so you can't complain. It no longer severs limbs, but then I suppose that would make sense. Without the plasma cutter or other weapons, Isaac's offensive abilities were limited. Melee options in Dead Space were very much a last resort, since there were only two moves. The first was a slow, heavy swing, where Isaac punched his enemy or pistol whipped them depending on what he had equipped. The whole purpose was using the weight of his spacesuit to put some oomph into his swing. However, while it was good at briefly knocking necromorphs back, it wasn't very good at removing limbs. His other melee option was a stomp, where he used his big heavy boots to slam downwards. This was useful for opening crates, but was also good at finishing off enemies who'd been knocked to the ground. Stomping on downed necromorphs was also pretty satisfying, especially with Isaac's grunt every time you did it. These melee options were combined in PlayStation All-Stars with the swipe knocking opponents to the floor, allowing him to follow up with a stomp. Sadly, Isaac no longer grunts while doing this, which is highly disappointing. The final kick of this melee combo is likely inspired by finishing moves that could be performed on attacking necromorphs. Sometimes necromorphs could leap on you, prompting a quick time event that required you to mash the X button until you broke free. One of the moves Isaac could do to break free was a kick to the face, which was pretty handy. In the world of Dead Space, technology had become particularly advanced. One indication of this was the Stasis module, which allowed Isaac to freeze the world around him. Essentially shooting out a blue gas-like substance, the Stasis module would freeze enemies and fast-moving objects in time, allowing Isaac to react faster to them before they could do anything to him. It was a tool used throughout the games, and was used not only to freeze enemies but also to solve puzzles. Its only disadvantage was that it was limited in its use, and needed to be recharged frequently. The Stasis module is also part of Isaac's moveset in PlayStation All-Stars, where it's now unlimited in its usage, but it's rather slow to shoot out. It also doesn't seem to keep opponents frozen for nearly as long as you could in Dead Space. The plasma cutter wasn't Isaac's only weapon. Throughout the games you could encounter shops that allowed you to purchase ammo and health kits, but also allowed you to buy new weapons if you could find appropriate schematics hidden in the levels. One notable weapon you could buy was the Ripper, which was a modified circular saw. With this weapon, Isaac would shoot out a spinning saw blade which would be tethered to the weapon using space-age gravity technology. The blade would spin constantly for a short period of time, and you could simply walk this blade into approaching enemies and they would be diced into tiny bits. It was rather nice. However, its weakness was that it proved kind of useless if an enemy managed to get past it. Not that that happened very often, of course. The Ripper is also part of Isaac's moveset in PlayStation All-Stars, although this time the blade is suspended in a single spot instead of movable, and it can juggle opponents that can get caught in it, although they no longer get diced to tiny bits. So the plasma cutter was a precise cutting tool, and the Ripper was used for the same things a modern saw blade was used for, but these were far from the only tools Isaac could modify. Miners in the Dead Space universe carried around a gun that sent out an explosive blast, allowing them to quickly crack their way through rocks with ease. When Isaac got his hands on the Force gun, however, he decided to use it as a space shotgun. This weapon was excellent at blasting attacking necromorphs back, opening up opportunities to start blasting them with something else. It could also explode anything that had low enough health, which was also pretty nice. The Force gun is in PlayStation All-Stars, and it's also very good at knocking opponents back, although it no longer explodes anybody, of course. It's a pretty nice attack though, and very useful in a number of situations. Speaking of explosive charges, what deep space mining and engineering operations would be complete without explosive devices? The Detonator Mine was introduced in Dead Space 2 and gave Isaac a very useful explosive trap. The detonators would stick to any surface and open out to reveal a laser tripwire. Anything that wandered into this tripwire set off the explosives and got blown to bits. This was incredibly useful in areas with charging enemies, although small spaces weren't ideal as they caused damage to Isaac too. They could also be moved after they'd been placed, since they could be retrieved at any time for later use, unless of course they'd already been exploded. The detonators are in Isaac's All-Stars moveset, although they can only be placed on the ground now and act more like Sly or Sweet Tooth's mines instead of the tripwire from the original games, since the explosion happens on impact with the body of the mine and not with the lasers. Each game in the Dead Space series featured flamethrowers. They weren't the best weapons in the game, however, since Dead Space required dismemberment for death and fire didn't really dismember quickly, but it could cause gradual chip damage and was useful as a side weapon to something like the plasma cutter. In the third Dead Space, weapon crafting was introduced, and with this you could create an almost never-ending supply of weaponry. One of the weapons you could craft was a flamethrower called the Magnesium Afterburner, which was a highly focused flamethrower weapon, meaning it caused a little more damage. It was also a little more useful as the game introduced more human enemies who were a little more vulnerable to being cooked. Isaac carries a Magnesium Afterburner on him in PlayStation All-Stars, and this gives him a very basic flamethrower move that he aims at the ground. It works a lot like other flamethrower moves in the game, doing lots and lots of small bits of damage. Each weapon in Dead Space had a secondary fire function. While some were simply utilities, such as the plasma cutter being able to switch between firing horizontally and vertically, some were brand new weapons in and of themselves. One weapon in Dead Space 2, the contact beam, was one of them. I'm not interested in the main weapon for this video, let's look at that alt fire. This was a small device that Isaac could punch into the ground to cause a small shockwave. This was pretty useful if you were getting surrounded, as it knocked enemies back, and the shockwave was capable of taking out some legs in the process. It could also be upgraded to cause a stasis effect. Even better, in the third game, the ground diffractor could now be equipped as a secondary fire for basically any gun you wanted, making it even more useful since it was no longer tethered to the contact beam. Isaac gets a ground diffractor in PlayStation All-Stars where it remains useful at causing a shockwave to knock opponents back, although of course it no longer takes out the legs of Isaac's attackers. Another secondary fire option you could equip to your weapons in Dead Space 3 was the hydraulic Eviscerator. This allowed you to hugely increase the power of pistol whipping your enemies as the lower part of your gun became a laser baton of sorts. It was a pretty nice tool to try and get encroaching necromorphs off your back, although it wasn't always the most useful weapon. Isaac gets a hydraulic Eviscerator in PlayStation All-Stars as well, increasing his melee options. This allows him to perform an uppercut of sorts, which can then be changed into other moves fairly easily. If you wanted something a little more traditional in Dead Space 3, you could construct a simple chain gun. This was basically a big old space machine gun. It was rapid fire and it was powerful, although not entirely precise while firing. Although sometimes that could be a good thing. There's not much else to say about it, however. It's a machine gun. What do you want? The chain gun turns up in PlayStation All-Stars as well, where Isaac now fires it exclusively upwards. It's basically the same weapon though. In Dead Space 3, many of the custom weapons had a tendency to veer away from the slow, cumbersome methods of defense from the previous games and moved into outright mass destruction. As proof of this, one weapon you could develop was the Incendiary Grenade launcher, which launched incendiary grenades, unsurprisingly. These were a type of grenade that exploded in a shower of fire. While they were a fire-based weapon, they felt a little more useful than the flamethrower weapons due to their explosive impact. They would typically explode, causing a lot of damage, and then the flames left over typically worked to finish the enemy off, so they were pretty nice. You just couldn't really use them at close range, because then it would hurt you. The Incendiary Grenade appears in PlayStation All-Stars, but it doesn't really have the fire aspect to it this time, and instead largely works like other grenades in the game that explode on impact. It fires in an arc, however, so it typically works best as part of a combo rather than just fired out. But if you wanted to craft something really awesome, one good choice was the bouncing Bola gun, which fired a large energy pellet. But it gets better. You see, it wasn't called the bouncing Bola for nothing, because if you fired it at the ground or at a wall, it would bounce off. Sounds cool, but here's the best part. Every time it bounced, it increased in power. This meant that simply bouncing a bola off the floor and into an approaching enemy basically exploded the enemy into tiny bits. If you don't find that immensely satisfying, then you're dead inside. Anyway, the bouncing bola makes an appearance in PlayStation All-Stars where it retains its magical ability to increase its power as it bounces off surfaces. It feels a little more fiddly in PlayStation All-Stars though, and certainly doesn't feel quite as powerful, but hey, it's still cool. Sometimes navigating haunted spaceships was a tough task, especially when they were huge and filled with maze-like corridors. Fortunately, Isaac had a little bit of help in that respect. He would have coordinates to his next destination sent to him by team members, allowing him to use his own personal GPS service, the Waypoint Marker. By tapping in the right stick in every Dead Space game, a smart laser would shoot out of Isaac's hand and trail its way towards the next objective. What you had to do then was follow the laser, or ignore the laser if you wanted to try and find extra ammo and secrets, because they were usually in the opposite direction. The Waypoint Marker became one of Isaac's taunts in PlayStation All-Stars. Why is it a taunt? I have no idea. I should also mention another weapon. In Dead Space 2, completing the game twice, including once on the hardest difficulty, granted you the hand cannon. This joke weapon was basically a foam finger used at sporting events that Isaac would point at enemies and yell, "Bang! Bang!" It was also the most powerful weapon in the game, capable of destroying anything in a single shot. No really, this is a taunt in PlayStation All-Stars for some reason, and it's also the only taunt capable of causing damage, although it's pretty hard to hit anyone with it. And again, quickly, before we get to the supers, I want to mention another little Easter egg. In the Dead Space games, all the info that would normally be on a HUD in most games was attached to Isaac's suit somehow instead. His health bar took the form of a light strip on his spine. At full health, this would be several blue segments, but as you took damage, there would be fewer segments and the colour would change from yellow to red. Because this was attached to Isaac's suit, they found a way to incorporate it into PlayStation All-Stars. If Isaac is winning, he will be shown at full health. Being in lower position sees Isaac on yellow or red health with fewer segments, just like in the original game. And now as usual, a quick recap. Isaac's level 1 isn't exactly an ability from Dead Space. Certainly the Stasis and the Plasma Cutter are abilities, but we've already talked about those because they're part of his normal moveset. However, if this strategic shot super is based on anything, it may potentially be referencing the ability to upgrade your weapons and Stasis module in the Dead Space games. Perhaps Isaac is pulling out a slightly more upgraded Plasma Cutter for the super. It's the best guess I have.
Level 2!
Stasis wasn't Isaac's only special suit module. He could also gain a Kinesis module, which allowed him to pick up heavy objects with little effort and move things around. You could then get rid of these objects in two different ways. You could simply drop them where they needed to go, or you could fire them outwards with a burst of gravitational energy. If this was a pointy thing, you could impale necromorphs with it, which was pretty handy. Kinesis is the basis for Isaac's level 2 super as well as his throws. However, it's only his throws that most resemble the original inspiration. The super, however, is a different matter. Just like his level 1 super, there isn't really anything specific from Dead Space, and it's more an interpretation of how AP orbs could affect Isaac's abilities. I think, maybe.
Level 3!
Dead Space is set in space. Yes, I know you figured that already, but bear with me. As I stated at the beginning, Isaac typically wore a heavy-duty suit, which was useful when he had to head out into the cold vacuum of space, since it meant he didn't violently decompress. It also kept him from drifting off into space due to its weightiness, which allowed it to cling to surfaces pretty easily. In the first Dead Space, vacuum and zero gravity sections were fairly limited, and Isaac could only really leap about in zero gravity. However, in Dead Space 2, Isaac gained some snazzy jet boots, which gave him greater movement in outer space. Many of these sections saw Isaac floating about in ways he couldn't in areas filled with gravity, allowing him more access to things for him to fix up. Dead Space 3 expanded on Isaac's adventures in space by putting in huge sections of space to explore and float around in, and a lot of oxygen to aid with this. Some of the more prominent areas were in a debris field in the orbit around the planet Tau Volantis, where much of the game took place. When approaching this debris field for the first time, Isaac blasted his way through space using his jet boots, dodging debris and floating mines that were there for some reason. The floating mines could also be seen randomly within the debris field, and you could shoot them to prevent them from blowing Isaac up. For Isaac's level 3, we head into space. Dead Space. No, really, that's what the super's called, I'm not just making a dumb pun. In this super, Isaac floats about with his jet boots, shooting other fighters who aren't as well equipped for space travel as our engineer friend. There's also debris and mines floating around, just like in Dead Space 3, which makes it harder for everyone to maneuver and avoid Isaac's shots. This super also has a passing resemblance to classic vector graphics arcade shoot-'em-up Asteroids, albeit looking a bit more defined graphically. It's not clear if this was intentional, but it's been mentioned a few times by the fanbase, so it's worth mentioning here. And that's Isaac, the last of the third-party characters. The next video will be up in a timely fashion, I hope, so stay tuned.